I need the money tomorrow. My daughter ordered me, slamming her hand on my table, demanding I pay off her husband's debt of $700,000. And no delays, her husband added, crossing his arms with a smug look on his face. I simply smiled, took a sip of my coffee, and said, "Okay." 4 hours later, I was at the airport. When they came back to my house the next day, expecting a fortune, they found only a locked door and a small wooden box. When they opened that box, they started screaming. If you are just finding this story, take a deep breath, because what I am about to tell you is a harsh lesson in betrayal family, and what happens when you mistake a quiet old man for a weak one. Before we begin, please hit the like button to support a father who had to make the hardest choice of his life. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my future stories, and tell me in the comments where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It makes me truly happy to know what corner of the world is listening to my voice today. It all started on a cold Tuesday afternoon inside my Chicago penthouse. The city skyline was stretching out behind the floor-to-ceiling windows, gray and unforgiving. But the real storm was happening right inside my living room. Valerie, the daughter. My late wife Martha and I had raised with every privilege we could afford, stood over my heavy mahogany dining table. She did not ask. She did not plead. She slammed a crumpled, terrifying demand notice right onto the polished wood. "I need the money tomorrow, Dad," she said, her voice sharp and completely devoid of any warmth or hesitation. Derek, her husband of 4 years, was leaning casually against my custom-built bookshelf. He wore a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my first car. He looked entirely too relaxed for a man who had just presented a massive debt out of thin air. And no delays, Derek added, his voice dripping with an arrogance that made my stomach churn. "We know you have the liquidity. It is just a drop in the bucket for you, Victor. $700,000. They said the number so casually, as if they were asking me to cover a simple dinner bill. I sat there in my leather armchair, feeling the heavy silence of the penthouse settle around us. I did not yell. I did not throw the paper back in their faces. Decades in the commercial real estate business had taught me one fundamental rule. Never let the opposition see your heart rate spike. Instead, I just looked at Derek. I looked at his perfectly manicured fingers resting against the spine of one of my books. His hands were soft, smooth, untouched by a single day of hard labor. My own hands resting on my lap were a completely different story. They were thick, scarred, and permanently calloused. I looked down at my knuckles, remembering the 40 years I spent breathing in drywall dust, hauling concrete bags, and freezing in the brutal Chicago winters. I started my business with nothing but a rusted pickup truck and a toolbox. I spent my youth waking up at 4 a.m, working on construction sites, until my muscles screamed, slowly building an empire of commercial properties, block by block. I bled for every single dollar in my bank account. And now this 42-year-old man, masquerading as some brilliant tech entrepreneur, thought he could swallow my life savings whole simply by snapping his fingers. Valerie tapped her foot impatiently against the hardwood floor. "Dad, are you listening to me? We do not have time for a lecture. The bank needs this cleared immediately, or Derek will lose his company." I shifted my gaze to my daughter. She looked so much like Martha in that moment, sharing the same dark hair and sharp jawline. But Martha had possessed a soul full of grace and gratitude. Martha would have been horrified to see the pure entitlement radiating from our daughter. I remembered how Martha used to hold Valerie when she was a little girl, whispering that she would grow up to be a strong, independent woman. We gave her everything. Private schools, a paid-off college tuition, a massive wedding. We padded her life with so much comfort that she never had to learn the value of a dollar or the heavy weight of a consequence. And this was the result. A 38-year-old woman demanding nearly $1 million as if it were her birthright. Derek sighed loudly, shifting his weight. "Look, Victor, I am on the verge of a massive breakthrough with my artificial intelligence software. This is just a temporary cash flow hiccup. You are an investor. You understand how these things work. The funds will be replenished next quarter, but right now we need you to write the check. I picked up my mug. The black coffee had gone cold, but I took a slow, deliberate sip anyway. I let the bitter taste wash over my tongue, using the moment to keep my expression completely neutral. Inside my mind, Son was racing, connecting the dots of a terrifying puzzle. My gut was screaming at me. A man who runs a legitimate tech startup does not need $700,000 in untraceable cash overnight. A legitimate bank does not send demand notices that look like cheap extortion threats. But I knew that if I challenged them right now, if I demanded the truth or refused the money, they would panic, cover their tracks, and find another way to manipulate me. I needed them to feel safe. I needed them to feel like they had won completely. I slowly set my coffee mug back down on the table. I smoothed out the wrinkles on the demand notice with my scarred fingers. I let a soft, tired sigh escape my lips, playing the exact role they expected me to play. The role of the exhausted, lonely father who would do absolutely anything to keep his daughter happy. "Okay," I said, my voice quiet and steady. Valerie blinked, caught slightly off guard by how easily I had surrendered. "Okay," she repeated. I nodded, forcing a warm, reassuring smile onto my face. I looked at Derek, who was already smirking, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. "Okay," I said again. "I understand, kids. Business can be tough, and I know you two are under a lot of pressure. I will help you out." Derek chuckled, pushing himself off the bookshelf. "I knew you would see reason, Victor. It is just business." "Yes, just business," I agreed smoothly. "However, a transfer of this size cannot be done through a simple phone application. I need to go down to the main bank branch downtown, speak with my wealth manager, and authorize a certified cashier's check. It will take a few hours to clear the security protocols." Valerie relaxed her shoulders, dropping as a wave of relief washed over her. "Thank God. Thank you, Dad. I knew we could count on you." I smiled at her, though it felt like ashes in my mouth. "Go home, get some rest. Come back here tomorrow at exactly 2 in the afternoon. The cashier's check for $700,000 will be sitting right here on this table waiting for you." Derek clapped his hands together, his smugness fully restored. "Perfect. See you tomorrow at 2, Victor. Try not to be late. We have a tight schedule." They did not even stay for another 5 minutes. They got what they came for, and the moment they had my promise, I ceased to be of any use to them. I sat quietly in my chair and watched them walk out the front door of my penthouse. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them, echoing through the empty apartment. The second the lock engaged, the warm grandfatherly smile vanished from my face. My hands stopped trembling. My grief instantly hardened into solid, freezing ice. I stood up from my chair and walked over to the window, looking down at the busy Chicago streets below. I watched Derek and Valerie emerge onto the sidewalk, laughing and holding hands, walking toward their luxury vehicle. They thought they had just conned a gullible old man out of his retirement fund. They thought they held all the power. They had no idea that I was not going to the bank. They had no idea that their perfect, arrogant little world was about to be completely dismantled. I pulled my phone from my pocket, dialed my estate attorney, and began packing a single travel bag. The war had just begun. The moment the heavy door clicked shut, the warm mask melted off my face. There was no time for tears. I had none left to shed. The grief that hollowed me out had calcified into something cold, sharp, and unbreakable. I walked to my bedroom, pulled a leather duffel bag from the closet, and tossed in the absolute essentials. A few changes of clothes, my passport, and the encrypted hard drives Garrison handed me 48 hours prior. I told Valerie and Derek I was heading downtown to authorize a wire transfer. I had no intention of going near a bank. I pulled out my phone and sent an encrypted text to Mitchell, my estate attorney, and Garrison, my private investigator. The message contained 3 words: execute the protocol. Taking the private elevator to the garage, my phone was shut off. I slid behind the wheel and merged onto the Chicago streets, leaving my old life behind. 4 hours later, I sat in a dimly lit corner of the first-class lounge at O'Hare International Airport. The atmosphere was a stark contrast to the storm raging inside my mind. Soft jazz played quietly as businessmen murmured over glowing laptops. I ordered a neat bourbon, taking a slow sip as I looked out the windows at the snow falling over the tarmac. My flight to Wyoming boarded in less than an hour. I set the glass down and unzipped my carry-on bag. I pulled out my iPad, placed it on the table, and opened a secured application. Within seconds, a grid of high-definition video feeds flooded the screen. These were not the standard security cameras built into the penthouse. Those had been conveniently disabled by Derek weeks ago under the guise of a system update. These were hidden micro-lenses Garrison and I installed inside air vents behind crown molding and within custom bookshelves. I tapped the feed labeled Living Room. The camera angle provided a perfect view of the mahogany dining table. Sitting dead center on that polished wood was a small dark wooden box. It looked harmless, but I knew exactly what was hidden inside. I stared at the live video feed tracing the digital edges of that wooden box. Tomorrow afternoon, exactly at 2 o'clock, my daughter and her husband would walk through the front door of my penthouse. They would strut in with absolute confidence, expecting to find a certified cashier's check for $700,000 waiting on that table. They would see the box instead. They would open it. And in that precise moment, their entire arrogant universe would violently collapse. They would realize the clueless old man they had been ruthlessly manipulating had spent the last 3 months building an inescapable financial and legal prison around them. But to fully understand the sheer gravity of what was waiting for them inside that box, to understand why a father would orchestrate such a devastating downfall for his own flesh and blood, we have to rewind the clock. We have to go back to the very beginning of this nightmare. The betrayal did not happen overnight. It was a slow, methodical poison that seeped into my life exactly 90 days ago. 3 months prior to my departure at the airport, the illusion of my perfect family was still intact. It was a brisk afternoon in early September. I was sitting in my study reviewing commercial real estate portfolios, enjoying the comfortable retirement I spent 4 decades earning. The intercom buzzed, and my concierge announced Valerie and Derek were coming up. I smiled, genuinely happy to see them. I walked to the foyer and opened the door with open arms. But the moment Derek stepped inside, my instincts picked up on an unsettling shift in the atmosphere. He wore his usual tailored suit, looking every bit the successful founder of an artificial intelligence software company, but his posture was unusually rigid. Valerie walked in closely behind him, her face tight with manufactured anxiety. They politely declined my offer for coffee. They did not ask about my health or how I was managing the house without Martha. They sat down on my living room sofa side by side, and Derek immediately launched into a perfectly rehearsed pitch. He looked me straight in the eye, wearing a convincing mask of exhausted determination. "Victor, I hate to bring business to your doorstep." He began rubbing the back of his neck as if carrying the weight of the entire world. "But we hit a small administrative roadblock at the company. I need a short-term bridge loan, $150,000. Just to cover payroll and essential operations for the next 3 weeks. I raised an eyebrow, leaning back slowly in my leather chair. $150,000 was not a small sum, even for a man of my means. I asked him calmly what kind of administrative roadblock could abruptly freeze a supposedly thriving tech startup overnight. Derek did not miss a single beat. He leaned forward, his voice smooth and dripping with professional frustration. "It is a routine bank audit, Victor. Completely standard procedure for a company of our scale right before a major funding round. The compliance department temporarily froze the operational accounts while they verify a few overseas vendor payments. It is purely bureaucratic nonsense. Our Series B funding clears on the 1st of next month, bringing in over $4 million. We just need to keep the lights on until the compliance officers finish their paperwork." Valerie reached out and placed her hand over mine, her eyes wide and pleading. "It is just a temporary bridge, Dad. You know how brilliant Derek is, and you know how much potential this software has. If we miss payroll, the developers will walk out and the seed round could fall apart. We just need a little help to get across the finish line. We would never ask you for this if it was not an absolute emergency. I looked down at my daughter's hand resting on top of mine. Her skin was soft, adorned with expensive rings. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe this was just a simple business transaction, a minor hurdle in their path to success. But as I shifted my gaze back to Derek, a chilling memory echoed clearly in the back of my mind. It was a memory of my late wife, Martha, lying in her hospital bed, just weeks before the cancer finally took her away from me. She had gripped my hand with surprising strength, her breathing shallow, but her eyes piercing and lucid. Victor, she had whispered, her voice frail but absolute. Watch Derek's eyes. Be careful with him. He looks at our daughter the exact same way a thief looks at a gold mine. He looks at her like she is nothing but a limitless credit card. Do not let him drain you. At the time, I had dismissed her words as the paranoia of a dying woman. I had thought she was simply being overly protective of our only child. Now, sitting across from the man who was smoothly asking for a massive sum of cash, Martha's warning rang through my head like a deafening siren. I kept my face perfectly still, betraying absolutely none of the sudden coldness washing over my entire body. Derek leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, interlacing his fingers in a gesture of practiced vulnerability. He looked exactly like a man carrying the heavy weight of a visionary empire on his shoulders, a performance he had undoubtedly perfected in front of countless venture capitalists and angel investors across the city. Victor, he said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. You built your real estate business from the ground up. You know that scaling a company requires immense capital, and sometimes the financial infrastructure struggles to keep pace with the actual growth. My artificial intelligence platform is currently processing millions of data points for offshore enterprise clients. But because we are expanding so rapidly, handling international wire transfers from newly acquired European clients, the bank flagged our primary operational account for a mandatory routine compliance audit. They simply froze the account to verify the overseas transactions. It is purely bureaucratic nonsense, but it has temporarily paralyzed my payroll. I need $150,000 just to bridge the gap for 3 weeks. The moment the audit clears, our Series B funding is scheduled to drop. That is a $4 million injection, Victor. I will pay you back the moment the funds clear with a generous interest rate for your trouble. But I was not just anyone. I was a man who had spent 40 years negotiating with ruthless contractors, corrupt city officials, and slippery bankers. I knew what a lie sounded like, no matter how much expensive cologne it wore. Yet before I could even formulate a response, Valerie shifted closer to me on the sofa. She reached out and wrapped both of her hands around my right arm, squeezing it affectionately. Her eyes were wide, shining with a manufactured, desperate innocence that broke my heart. It is just a bridge loan, Dad, she pleaded, her voice trembling just enough to sound authentic. You know how brilliant Derek is, and you know how much potential this predictive software has. He has been working 80-hour weeks, barely sleeping, pouring his entire soul into this project. If we miss payroll this Friday, his lead developers will walk out, and the entire seed round could completely fall apart. We just need a little help to get across the finish line. We would never, ever ask you for this if it was not an absolute emergency. As I looked down at my daughter, the memory of Martha washed over me again, stronger and more painful this time. Martha had never liked Derek. From the very first evening Valerie brought him home for a formal family dinner, my wife had watched him with a quiet, calculated suspicion. I remembered how Derek had charmed everyone else in the room, pouring expensive wine, dropping names of influential tech investors, and boasting about his disruptive visions for the future. I had been impressed, completely blinded by his charisma and his tailored suits. But later that night, as we were preparing for bed, Martha had sat at her vanity, brushing her hair with sharp, angry strokes. He is a salesman, Victor, she had told me, meeting my eyes in the mirror. He just sells illusions. When he looks at Valerie, he does not see a partner. I had argued with her, defending the young man, insisting that we should give him a fair chance to prove his worth. I had been so desperately eager to see my daughter happy that I actively chose to ignore the subtle red flags. I chose to ignore how Derek always let Valerie pick up the check at restaurants, claiming his wealth was tied up in illiquid stock options. I chose to ignore how he constantly asked probing questions about my commercial properties, subtly trying to calculate my net worth during casual conversations. Martha had seen it all, but I had stubbornly refused to listen. And now, sitting in my study, staring at the exact man she had warned me about, I realized with sickening clarity that my beautiful, brilliant wife had been entirely right from the very beginning. I took a slow, deep breath, maintaining eye contact with my son-in-law. However, handing over a massive pile of cash, without any collateral or oversight, was a dangerous precedent to set, especially with a man I was rapidly beginning to distrust. I needed to test him. I needed to see how he would react when pressed for accountability. I nodded slowly, allowing a thoughtful expression to settle over my features. I understand the challenges of running a rapidly expanding business, Derek, I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and measured. Bureaucracy can certainly strangle an operation if you are not prepared for it. I am willing to provide the capital you need to keep your developers paid and your company afloat. Valerie let out a loud gasp of relief, throwing her arms around my neck in a tight, dramatic embrace. "Oh, thank you, Dad. I knew you would understand. I knew you would save us." Derek smiled brightly, leaning back against the plush cushions of the sofa, looking entirely victorious. "You have no idea how much stress you have just lifted off my shoulders. I will have my finance department draft a simple receipt for your records tomorrow morning." "No, Derek," I replied instantly, my voice dropping an octave, losing all of its previous warmth. "I will have my estate attorney draft a formal promissory note, a legally binding contract detailing the exact terms of the loan, the precise interest rate, and a strict repayment schedule based on the successful closure of your upcoming Series B funding round. We will execute the documents properly, just as any legitimate financial institution would require." The temperature in the room plummeted in an absolute instant. For a fraction of a second, the charismatic tech entrepreneur mask completely dissolved from Derek's face. His eyes narrowed, flashing, with a sudden, poorly concealed surge of pure, unadulterated rage. He was deeply insulted that I dared to demand legal accountability instead of simply handing him a blank check. I saw the real Derek the Predator hiding behind the tailored suits and the hollow Silicon Valley buzzwords. He quickly recovered, forcing a stiff, unnatural laugh that echoed awkwardly through my silent study. "Of course, Victor," he stammered, rubbing his palms together. "If that makes you feel more comfortable, we can certainly involve the lawyers." "Family is family, Derek," I countered smoothly, never breaking eye contact. "But business is always business. Mixing the two without proper documentation is a recipe for disaster." Valerie bristled, pulling away from my side and crossing her arms defensively over her chest. "You always have to make things so clinical, Dad." She snapped, her tone dripping with sudden venom. "Derek is your son-in-law. He is trying to build an empire for our future, and you are acting like a ruthless loan shark. Why do you always have to be so difficult and untrusting?" "Because I spent 40 years bleeding on construction sites to build the wealth you are currently sitting on." "Valerie," I said, my voice dangerously soft, "I do not hand out six-figure sums based solely on blind faith and a charming smile. If Derek's company is as solid as he claims, a standard promissory note will not be an issue." Derek held up his hands in a placating gesture, casting a warning glance toward my daughter. "It is fine, Val. Do not argue with him. Victor is absolutely right. I will gladly sign whatever legal documents your attorney prepares. We have nothing to hide and the funding is guaranteed. We will get this sorted out tomorrow. I will sign the note and you can transfer the funds." He smiled again, but the warmth never reached his eyes. It was a cold, calculating smile. They stayed for another 20 minutes, drinking coffee and pretending everything was perfectly normal, but the atmosphere was irreparably shattered. When they finally left my penthouse, walking out into the brisk Chicago evening, I stood completely alone in the center of my study, listening to the heavy silence surrounding me. I had agreed to write the check. I was going to give them the $150,000. But as I walked over to my desk and picked up my phone, a cold, heavy alarm bell began ringing relentlessly in my chest. The promissory note was merely a test, and Derek's visceral reaction to it had provided all the answers I needed. I knew the money was going to disappear. The artificial intelligence startup was nothing but a fragile house of cards designed to extract capital from willing victims, and my own daughter was either hopelessly manipulated or actively complicit in the deception. I slowly dialed my estate attorney's private number, staring out the window at the city skyline. I was going to give them the rope they so desperately demanded, but I was going to make damn sure I controlled the other end of it. The first battle had been fought, and the war was officially underway. I kept my expression blank, burying the adrenaline beneath decades of practiced stoicism. The silence stretched as Derek and Valerie waited. They thought they were reeling in an aging father. But negotiating real estate contracts in Chicago had taught me to read between the lines. I knew the difference between a temporary setback and a man drowning in a self-made disaster. Derek was drowning. I looked at Valerie, her eyes wide with manufactured anxiety, realizing she was fully tethered to him. If I refused the money, they would scramble, cover their tracks, and find another target. I needed to keep them close. I needed to maintain the illusion that I was still the compliant father they believed me to be. I forced a deep sigh, letting my shoulders slump. "You know I would do anything for you, Valerie," I said gently. "I understand the volatile nature of the tech sector, Derek. Startups burn through capital, and compliance audits can be a nightmare. I am willing to bridge this gap. I will write the check." The transformation was instantaneous. Valerie let out a dramatic breath, melting against the sofa. "Thank you, Dad," she breathed. Derek leaned back, his confidence restored. He flashed a winning smile reserved for closing acquisitions. "I appreciate your vision, Victor. This is a solid investment. You have my word, when our funding clears next month, I will wire the funds back with a generous interest rate. We consider this a formal partnership." I stood up slowly from my leather armchair. "A formal partnership," I repeated quietly. I walked over to my oak desk and opened the bottom drawer. "If we are entering into a formal partnership, Derek, we need to adhere to proper protocols. My empire was built on absolute legal clarity. A handshake is goodwill, but a contract is a guarantee of survival." I pulled out a blank promissory note drafted years ago for personal loans. I picked up my fountain pen and carefully filled in the blanks. The principal amount of $150,000, the agreed interest rate, the strict 30-day repayment deadline. The silence in the room shifted to something strained as the scratching of my pen echoed off the high ceilings. I finished writing, capped the pen, and walked back over to the sitting area. I placed the document squarely on the glass coffee table right in front of Derek. I tapped the bottom line with my index finger. "Just a standard promissory note," I said, keeping my tone conversational. "It legally formalizes the debt and protects both of our interests. Since the seed funding is guaranteed to arrive next month, this is merely a simple formality. Please read it over and sign at the bottom." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. I watched Derek closely, tracking every microscopic shift in his facial expressions. For a fraction of a second, his charismatic mask slipped completely off. His jaw muscles tightened so hard I could see the tension radiating down his neck. His eyes flashed with sudden, pure, unadulterated rage. It was the look of a predator who had just realized the trap he set for his prey had teeth of its own. He felt deeply insulted that I dared to demand legal accountability instead of simply handing him a blank check. In that fleeting moment, I saw the real Derek. I saw the calculating fraudster Martha had warned me about. The silence stretched, becoming agonizingly thick. Then Derek forcefully swallowed his anger. He blinked rapidly, instantly reconstructing his charming facade. He let out a stiff, unnatural laugh. "Of course, Victor," he said, his voice a pitch too high. "I completely understand. Business is business, right? He reached for the pen, but Valerie bristled. She sat up straight, crossing her arms defensively, glaring at me with open hostility. You always have to make things so incredibly clinical, Dad, she snapped, her voice dripping with resentment. Derek is trying to build a massive empire for our future, and you are acting like a ruthless corporate loan shark. We came to you for help, not for an interrogation. Why do you always have to be so untrusting? Her words hit me like a physical blow. My own daughter was defending a man who was manipulating her, turning her anger against the father who had protected her. I kept my face impassive. Because I spent 40 years bleeding on construction sites to build the wealth you are currently sitting on, Valerie. I replied, my voice dangerously quiet. I do not hand out six-figure sums based solely on blind faith and a charming smile. If Derek's company is as solid as he claims, a standard legal document will not be an issue. Derek placed a hand on Valerie's knee, playing the role of the reasonable peacemaker. It is fine, Val, he said smoothly. Do not argue with him. Victor is absolutely right. I will gladly sign whatever legal documents he requires. We have absolutely nothing to hide and the funding is guaranteed. He picked up the fountain pen and quickly signed his name at the bottom of the page, pushing the document back toward me with a tight, forced smile. There you go, Victor. All official. I picked up the paper, examining the signature. It was rushed, angry, but legally binding. Good, I said, nodding slowly. I will initiate the wire transfer to your account right now. I pulled out my phone, logged into my secure banking portal, and authorized the transfer of $150,000. I watched the confirmation screen load, fully aware that I was throwing a massive fortune into an absolute void. But I needed this transaction. I needed the paper trail to establish the baseline of their deception. The transfer is complete, I announced, setting the phone down. The funds should be available within the hour. Valerie stood up immediately, smoothing out her expensive dress, not bothering to say thank you. Come on, Derek, she said coldly. We have work to do. Derek stood up, buttoning his jacket. Thank you again, Victor. You are a lifesaver. I walked them to the door, maintaining the polite facade until the very last second. I watched them step into the hallway, waiting for the heavy oak door to finally click shut between us. When the lock engaged, I stood alone in the quiet foyer. I looked down at the signed promissory note in my hand. The ink was barely dry, but the betrayal was already permanently etched into my life. The cold, heavy alarm bell that had been ringing faintly in my chest now sounded like a deafening siren. My daughter was hostile. My son-in-law was a liar. And my money was gone. I knew then that I could no longer sit idly by and wait for the truth to reveal itself. I had to rip it out of the shadows. I walked back to my study, picking up my phone. It was time to start fighting back. Exactly 14 days passed before I saw them. I spent those 2 weeks maintaining the facade of the supportive, unquestioning father. I did not text Derek about the software company, and I did not call Valerie to bring up her defensive outburst. I simply let the silence settle between us, knowing that desperation would eventually drive them back to my door. As expected, Valerie reached out on a Thursday, her voice sweet over the phone, inviting herself and Derek over for Sunday dinner. I agreed, instructing my private chef to prepare a roasted tenderloin. I wanted the evening to feel as normal and luxurious as they were accustomed to. When they arrived at my penthouse that Sunday evening, they walked in carrying an expensive bottle of wine, behaving as if the tense negotiation over the promissory note had never occurred. Derek was back in his element, wearing a cashmere sweater and flashing his signature charismatic smile. Valerie kissed my cheek, her perfume filling the foyer, chatting animatedly about a new art gallery opening downtown. They were completely at ease, entirely convinced that my $150,000 wire transfer had permanently secured their safety. I played the gracious host, pouring the wine and leading them to the formal dining room. The massive crystal chandelier above the dining table cast a warm, elegant glow over the silver cutlery and the fine china. We took our seats and the chef began serving the first course. Valerie sat directly across from me, laughing at a joke Derek had just made about the terrible traffic on the Magnificent Mile. As she leaned her head back, the light from the chandelier hit her chest, drawing my eye to the jewelry resting against her collarbone. It was the 3-carat emerald-cut diamond pendant I had given my late wife Martha for our 30th wedding anniversary. It was a flawless stone meticulously sourced from a private dealer in Antwerp. I remembered the exact moment I fastened it around Martha's neck, the way the genuine diamond had caught the dim restaurant lighting and exploded with a brilliant, undeniable fire. Martha had cherished that necklace. She had worn it to every major family milestone right up until her final days. When she passed away, I had placed it in a velvet box and handed it to Valerie, telling her to keep a piece of her mother close to her heart. But as I stared at the pendant resting on my daughter's chest tonight, my breath caught in my throat. The stone catching the light of my chandelier was completely lifeless. It lacked the sharp internal depth of the diamond I had purchased. The edges of the cut were slightly rounded, and the light reflecting off the facets was flat and glassy, entirely devoid of the colorful dispersion that defines a true, flawless gem. I had spent decades appraising high-end properties, examining architectural details down to the millimeter. My eyes were trained to spot structural flaws and cheap materials disguised as luxury. I did not need a jeweler's loupe to see the devastating truth hanging around my daughter's neck. It was a replica, a cheap cubic zirconia fake. My mind raced, struggling to process the sheer gravity of this silent discovery. To replicate a custom piece of fine jewelry requires a specific intentional effort. It meant Valerie had actively taken her deceased mother's sacred anniversary gift to a pawn shop or a private buyer. She had sold the genuine diamond for cash and paid a fraction of the cost to have a fake stone set into the original platinum clasp, assuming I was too old and too blind to ever notice the difference. The betrayal felt like a jagged piece of glass twisting slowly in my stomach. The money I had just given them was apparently not enough. Their financial rot was so deep, so ravenous, that my daughter was secretly liquidating our family heirlooms to feed it. I very carefully set my wine glass down on the crisp linen tablecloth, forcing my hands to remain perfectly steady. "That is a beautiful necklace, Valerie," I said, keeping my voice completely casual and warm. "Your mother always loved how that diamond looked on you. It is wonderful to see you wearing it tonight." The physical reaction was instantaneous, and it told me everything I needed to know. Valerie froze mid-sentence. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her face pale and suddenly very fragile. Her right hand flew up to her chest, her fingers nervously wrapping around the fake stone, trying to physically hide it from my gaze. "Oh," she stammered, her eyes darting away from mine, suddenly fascinated by her plate. "Thank you, Dad. I just felt like having her close to me today." She cleared her throat awkwardly, taking a quick, unsteady sip of her water. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly very interested in cutting his meat, avoiding looking at either of us. The heavy, suffocating guilt radiating from across the table was absolutely undeniable. I did not press the issue of the necklace. Confronting her about the fake diamond right now would only cause her to become defensive, and I needed them to keep talking. I needed to gauge exactly how much water their sinking ship was taking on. I shifted my attention to my son-in-law, offering him a polite, inquisitive smile. "So, Derek," I began, resting my forearms on the edge of the table. "It has been 2 weeks since our transaction. How is the compliance audit going with the bank? Has the operational account been unfrozen yet?" Derek stiffened. The charming ease he had carried into the penthouse vanished, replaced by a rigid, defensive posture. He put his fork down and wiped his mouth with his napkin, buying himself precious seconds to formulate a response. "Well, you know how banking institutions are these days, Victor," he said, forcing a weary chuckle that sounded entirely hollow. "Bureaucratic red tape is completely strangling the financial sector. We provided them with all the overseas vendor invoices they requested, but now they are waiting on a secondary review from their international compliance division. It is just a slow, agonizing process. And what about the Series B funding? I asked, my voice remaining light and conversational. You mentioned the seed round was guaranteed to clear on the 1st of the month. That is only a few days away. Surely the investors are aware of the bank delay. Derek's eyes darted toward Valerie for a fraction of a second before returning to me. The panic hiding behind his pupils was unmistakable. Yes, absolutely, he lied smoothly. The investors are fully briefed. However, they want the operational account fully active before they initiate the wire transfer. It is a standard liability clause in their investment contracts. We just have to wait for the bank to finish their paperwork, and then everything will fall perfectly into place. Your bridge loan was a lifesaver, Victor. It gave us the breathing room we needed to keep the developers focused. I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch, just long enough to make him sweat. I am glad I could be of assistance, Derek, I said softly. I look forward to seeing the company flourish once the capital arrives. As he eagerly changed the subject to a recent golf tournament, I sat quietly dissecting the absolute absurdity of his explanation. Institutional investors do not delay multi-million-dollar funding rounds because a basic operational account is under a routine compliance review. They simply establish an escrow account or reroute the capital to a verified subsidiary. Derek's story was crumbling under the weight of its own logical inconsistencies. He was drowning in a sea of fabricated corporate jargon. The chilling reality settled over me with absolute certainty. The $150,000 I had transferred to him 2 weeks ago was already completely gone. It had not been used to cover payroll or appease software developers. It had been instantly swallowed by whatever massive, invisible financial black hole Derek was desperately trying to hide. And the fact that Valerie was secretly pawning her mother's flawless diamond proved that they were bleeding cash at a terrifying, unsustainable rate. They had no corporate investors. They possessed no upcoming funding round whatsoever. They only had debts, deceitful lies, and an insatiable hunger for my money. I finished the remainder of my roasted tenderloin dinner with mechanical precision, chewing and swallowing the meat while tasting nothing. I looked at the two people sitting across from me in my own home, eating the food I provided, drinking the wine I poured, and smiling with mouths full of calculated deceit. They were convinced they were the smartest people in the room, effortlessly draining an old man of his life's work. I smiled back at them, nodding along to their hollow stories, while my mind plotted the absolute destruction of the world they had built. The dessert plates had been cleared away by my private chef, leaving only the remnants of our strained conversation hovering in the warm air of the formal dining room. I suggested we move to the living room to enjoy a final cup of decaffeinated coffee before they made their way back to their townhouse. Derek eagerly agreed, clearly desperate to escape the intense, unspoken scrutiny I had been silently applying over the roasted tenderloin. He stood up from his chair a little too quickly, his linen napkin slipping from his lap onto the hardwood floor. He retrieved his tailored wool overcoat from the mahogany coat rack near the foyer, claiming he needed to check his pockets for his car keys. As he hoisted the heavy fabric over his arm, a sudden sharp clatter broke the quiet elegance of my penthouse. A small black rectangular object slipped from the inner breast pocket of his expensive coat and hit the marble tile with a harsh smack. It slid across the smooth floor, stopping just inches from the tip of my leather shoe. I looked down. It was a phone. But it was not the sleek flagship smartphone Derek perpetually flaunted during his business meetings. It was a cheap plastic prepaid burner phone, the kind of disposable device you buy with cash at a gas station counter. The screen immediately lit up, vibrating violently against the marble, displaying a blocked incoming number. The reaction that followed was entirely disproportionate to the event. A legitimate tech entrepreneur dropping a secondary work device might sigh, pick it up, and perhaps apologize for the minor interruption. Derek did none of those things. His face drained of all color, transforming into a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. A thick layer of sweat instantly broke out across his forehead, gleaming under the bright foyer lights. He practically dove toward my feet, snatching the cheap plastic device from the floor with visibly trembling hands. Without offering a single word of explanation, he turned his back on us, shoved the sliding glass door open, and practically sprinted out onto the freezing, wind-swept patio. He pulled the heavy glass door shut behind him, sealing himself outside in the biting Chicago cold without even bothering to put his coat on. I stood perfectly still, watching him pace back and forth on the terrace through the glass. He had the phone pressed tightly to his ear, his free hand gesturing wildly in the air, his body language screaming of sheer desperation and absolute submission. He was not speaking to an angel investor. He was not handling a delayed international wire transfer. He was taking direct orders from someone who utterly terrified him. I slowly turned my attention back to my daughter. Valerie was standing frozen near the edge of the living room rug, her hands tightly gripping the fabric of her designer dress. Her eyes were fixed on the patio doors, her chest rising and falling, with shallow, rapid breaths. She was terrified, but she was trying desperately to hide it behind a wall of manufactured composure. I took a slow, measured step toward her, keeping my voice incredibly gentle and calm. "Valerie," I said quietly, making sure not to startle her. "Why is the chief executive officer of an artificial intelligence startup carrying a $30 disposable phone?" I expected her to break down. I expected her to cry, to confess that they were in terrible trouble, to ask for my help, just as she had done when she was a little girl. I was entirely prepared to wrap my arms around her, forgive her for pawning her mother's flawless diamond necklace, and fix whatever catastrophic financial mess Derek had dragged her into. But the daughter standing in front of me was no longer the little girl Martha and I had raised. Valerie whipped her head around to face me. The fear in her eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a dark, vicious hostility that physically took my breath away. Her features contorted into a snarl of pure resentment. "Why are you constantly interrogating us, Dad?" she hissed, her voice dripping with venomous defense. Her volume was loud, deliberately designed to intimidate me into immediate silence. Derek is under immense stress from his investors right now. He is managing highly sensitive corporate data, and he needs secure, separate lines of communication for different overseas departments. Why must you automatically assume the absolute worst about the man I married? I stood my ground, my voice remaining soft but unyielding. Because men managing legitimate corporate data do not run out into freezing weather without a coat to answer a prepaid phone, Valerie. They do not sweat and shake when a device falls out of their pocket. Something is profoundly wrong here, and I am asking you to tell me the truth. She stepped directly into my personal space, her face flushed with entirely misplaced anger. "You want the truth," she spat out, jabbing her manicured finger toward my chest. "The truth is that you have millions of dollars just sitting in idle investment accounts, collecting interest while we are fighting every single day to build our own empire. You sit up here in your luxury penthouse completely disconnected from the struggles of modern business, judging every single move we make. We came to you for a simple bridge loan, and instead of supporting us gracefully, you have done nothing but nitpick his phones, question his audits, and suffocate us with your relentless suspicion. You are suffocating us, Dad. You are completely suffocating us." The words echoed off the high ceilings of the penthouse, sharp and devastating. She breathed heavily, glaring at me with a hatred so palpable it felt like a physical weight settling over my chest. In that precise moment, a profound and irreversible shift occurred within my soul. The visceral, agonizing pain of watching my own daughter viciously defend a blatant fraudster while actively attacking the father who had given her everything was absolute. It killed the last lingering traces of my blind, forgiving paternal love. I looked at the cubic zirconia stone resting on her chest. I looked at the rage twisting her familiar features. I realized she was not a victim desperately in need of rescue. She was an active, willing participant in my financial execution. She was standing in the home my blood and sweat had paid for, wearing the counterfeit ghost of her dead mother's jewelry, attempting to gaslight me into surrendering my wealth to a criminal. She had chosen her allegiance. She had decided that my only remaining value on this earth was the size of my bank account. The deep mourning period for the daughter I thought I knew officially ended. The hopeful, lonely father who just wanted to keep his family intact died right there on the living room rug. What remained was the man who had spent 40 years surviving the most cutthroat commercial real estate markets in the country. The man who had crushed rival developers, outsmarted corrupt city officials, and built an impenetrable legacy out of sheer concrete and steel. The predator finally awakened. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or defend my actions. I simply absorbed her venomous outburst and let it wash over me, locking my emotional vault permanently. I took a deliberate step back, physically distancing myself from her toxic presence. "I apologize, Valerie," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. It was as cold and flat as a frozen lake. "You are entirely right. I have been overly intrusive. I am just an old man who does not understand the complexities of modern software development. I should not have questioned Derek's methods. I will back off and let you two handle your affairs without my interference." The sudden lack of resistance immediately disarmed her. Her aggressive posture faltered. She blinked, clearly confused by my rapid surrender. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to soften her harsh words, but the glass door slid open behind us. Derek stepped back into the warmth of the penthouse. His face was pale, his lips slightly blue from the freezing wind. He shoved the burner phone deep into his trouser pocket, forcing a weak, trembling smile. "Sorry about that, Victor," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Just a minor emergency with one of the offshore server farms. Everything is handled now. We really should be going." I nodded politely, gesturing toward the foyer. "Of course. Drive safely, both of you." I walked them to the front door, maintaining the polite, detached facade of a defeated old man. I watched them step into the elevator holding hands, convinced they had successfully bullied me into absolute submission. I waited for the heavy metal doors to slide shut, securing their departure. I walked back into my study, my mind operating with chilling clarity. I was no longer an old man trying to save his family. I was a man preparing for war. I picked up my phone to call Mitchell and Garrison. It was time to step into the shadows and rip their entire world completely apart. I dialed Mitchell first. The line rang twice before his sharp voice answered. I gave him a time and location, followed immediately by a call to Garrison, with the exact same instructions. For the next 72 hours, I fully embraced the role they had violently assigned to me. I became the gullible, lonely, clueless old man. I sent Valerie text messages asking about the weather and reminding her to take vitamins. I called Derek to apologize for my intrusive behavior, asking him to forgive an anxious father who did not understand the modern world of technology. I listened to his condescending tone through the receiver, absorbing every drop of his arrogance, allowing him to believe he had completely neutralized me. I needed them absolutely comfortable, convinced that their secret was safe while I silently built the guillotine. On Wednesday morning, I left my penthouse through the private freight elevator, bypassing the main lobby entirely. I drove my unassuming sedan through the heavy Chicago traffic, winding my way toward the industrial district. I parked in the subterranean garage of a brutalist concrete building I had purchased nearly 2 decades prior. The property was heavily secured, currently leased to a private data storage firm, but I maintained a personal windowless boardroom in the deepest sub-basement. The room was lined with acoustic paneling, completely soundproofed, and routinely swept for electronic surveillance. It was a room designed for conversations that did not legally exist. When I unlocked the heavy steel door and stepped inside, the stark fluorescent lights hummed to life. Mitchell and Garrison were already waiting for me, sitting at opposite ends of a long mahogany table. They were two of the most dangerous men in the city, operating in entirely different spheres of influence. Mitchell was my estate attorney, a man whose tailored Italian suits and silver hair masked a legal mind so terrifyingly ruthless he had once bankrupted a rival developer using a single strategically placed zoning loophole. He sat with his hands steepled, an expression of absolute focus radiating from his cold gray eyes. Garrison sat in the shadows near the corner, a stark contrast to the lawyer. He was a former Federal Bureau of Investigation operative, who now ran the premier private intelligence firm in the Midwest. He was built like a vault, wearing a dark tactical jacket, his eyes constantly scanning the perimeter, even in a locked room. He did not deal in loopholes. He dealt in buried secrets, erased hard drives, and the kind of leverage that made powerful men disappear. I walked to the head of the table and set my leather briefcase down. The heavy thud echoed against the acoustic walls. I did not offer pleasantries or small talk. I unclasped the briefcase and pulled out 2 thick manila folders, sliding them across the polished wood. I looked directly at the private investigator first. Garrison. I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of the weakness I had shown my daughter. I need you to hunt. I pushed the first folder toward him. It contained every single piece of information I possessed on my son-in-law. Derek's full name, his social security number, the address of his supposed artificial intelligence software startup, and the exact routing numbers for the operational bank accounts he claimed were currently frozen by compliance audits. I also included a detailed description of the cheap prepaid burner phone that had fallen out of his overcoat 2 nights prior. Garrison opened the folder, his thick fingers turning the pages with methodical precision. He did not show a shred of surprise. He simply absorbed the data, his mind already calculating the angles of attack. I want you to tear his entire life apart, I instructed, leaning forward, resting my knuckles on the table. Leave absolutely no stone unturned. I want to know where he goes when he leaves his townhouse. I want to know who he calls on that disposable phone. I want his internet search history, his encrypted messaging applications, and his physical movements tracked 24 hours a day. I want to know if he is gambling, if he is feeding an addiction, or if he is hiding a mistress in the suburbs. Most importantly, Garrison, I want you to find exactly where my $150,000 went. He claimed it was for payroll, but we both know that is a pathetic lie. Trace the wire transfer I sent him. Find the shell companies. Find the offshore accounts. Find the people he is truly answering to. I want his financial autopsy sitting on this table by next week. Garrison closed the folder, sliding it into his dark jacket. Consider him an open book. Victor the investigator replied, his voice a deep, resonant rumble. If he is breathing, I will have a record of it. If he moved your money, I will bring you the exact coordinates. He will not even feel the breeze when I dismantle his privacy. I nodded, satisfied, and turned my attention to the other end of the table. Mitchell was watching me, his sharp eyes evaluating my unprecedented hostility. He had managed my wealth for 15 years, but he had never seen me actively mobilize against my own flesh and blood. Mitchell, I said, pushing the second folder toward him. Your turn. I need you to pull the deeds to every single commercial property I own in the greater Chicago area. I want the titles to the apartment complexes in the Gold Coast, the office buildings in the Loop, and the retail spaces in River North. I want the entire portfolio laid out in front of me immediately. Mitchell opened his folder, revealing the preliminary lists of my holding companies. He adjusted his platinum cufflinks, his legal mind immediately shifting into high gear. Are we liquidating Victor? He asked, his tone perfectly neutral. Are you preparing to move liquid assets out of the country to avoid a familial financial entanglement? We are not liquidating a single brick. Mitchell, I replied, my voice dropping an octave, ringing with absolute authority. We are restructuring the entire empire. I want you to draft ironclad, irrevocable trusts. I want every single property, every liquid asset, every stock portfolio, and every offshore reserve account completely insulated. I want my wealth wrapped in so much legal armor that neither Valerie nor Derek could access a single dime, even if they possessed my severed hand to sign the checks. You are going to build a financial fortress around my legacy. Mitchell offered a slow, predatory smile. He lived for this kind of complex, aggressive corporate warfare. The trusts will be completely impenetrable, he assured me, pulling a silver pen from his pocket to take rapid notes. I will institute blind control mechanisms and phantom holding companies. On paper, it will appear as though you have completely divested yourself of your own empire. They will not be able to pierce the corporate veil. But what about the promissory note Derek signed for the $150,000? Do you want me to prepare the civil litigation to demand immediate repayment? No, I answered quickly, holding up my hand to stop him. Do not touch the promissory note yet. Do not send any demand letters and do not alert his bank. If we launch a civil suit right now, we will only panic them into destroying the evidence of their fraud. I need that promissory note as a quiet anchor, a legal tripwire that I will manually trigger when the timing is absolutely perfect. Let him believe he has successfully conned me. Let him believe the money is his to spend. We will use the debt not just to recover the funds, but to legally suffocate him when he is most vulnerable. I walked around the table, the adrenaline of war sharpening every sense in my body. The deep betrayal I had suffered over the past 2 weeks had completely burned away my paternal hesitation. Valerie had made her choice when she stood in my living room defending a liar and screaming that I was suffocating her. She pawned her mother's sacred jewelry. She had chosen a life of deceptive luxury over the father who protected her, and Derek had chosen to view me as a wealthy, clueless target to be drained and discarded. I looked at both of my operatives. Mitchell Garrison, I said, my voice echoing coldly in the soundproof room. For 40 years, I have built properties. I have constructed foundations meant to last for generations. But starting today, we are in the business of demolition. I want you to gather the gasoline. I want you to place the explosives under every pillar of Derek's life. We will not alert them. We will simply play our parts and wait until the investigation is complete. When we have every piece of the puzzle, when we know exactly where my money went, I will personally light the match. The very next afternoon, I initiated the first phase of my own covert operation. Garrison was already tracking Derek through the physical world, but I needed direct access to his digital empire. I needed the raw, unfiltered data that flowed seamlessly through his private devices. To get that, I had to play directly into the arrogant stereotype he had already assigned to me. I picked up my phone and sent a perfectly crafted text message to my son-in-law. I kept the grammar formal and slightly clumsy, asking if he had time to stop by the penthouse after his meetings. I told him my personal laptop was acting erratically, plagued by endless pop-up windows and a sluggish processor. I suggested it might be a virus and asked if the brilliant tech founder could spare 10 minutes to help an old man figure out his machine. The response was almost instantaneous. Derek replied with an abundance of fake enthusiasm, assuring me he would be happy to swing by around 6 o'clock. He was eager to maintain the illusion of the helpful, devoted son-in-law, especially after I had so willingly handed over the bridge loan. When the private elevator chimed at 6 o'clock sharp, I was waiting in the foyer. Derek stepped out, looking every inch the successful entrepreneur. He wore a crisp navy suit, carrying his sleek silver MacBook tucked securely under his left arm. He greeted me with a firm handshake, completely oblivious to the trap he was walking into. I led him into the study, where my own heavy, outdated laptop was sitting open on the mahogany desk. He placed his pristine MacBook down on the side table, casually dropping his leather briefcase next to it. He walked over to my desk and immediately began clicking through my settings, sighing with practiced patience as he pointed out minor software updates I had supposedly neglected. I stood behind him, playing the part perfectly. I nodded along, asking naive questions about malware and firewalls, feeding his enormous ego with every single word. After a few minutes of his condescending technical lecture, I clapped him on the shoulder. "I appreciate you taking the time to do this, Derek," I said warmly. "In fact, I recently acquired a bottle of Macallan 25-year-old single malt scotch. It is a rare vintage, and I have been waiting for the right occasion to open it. Why do not you step into the kitchen and pour us both a glass, while this outdated machine finishes running the diagnostic scan you just started? The kitchen is fully stocked, and the crystal tumblers are in the upper left cabinet. Take your time and pour us a generous measure. We can toast to the brilliant future of your software company." Derek's eyes lit up at the mention of the expensive scotch. The man had a weakness for luxury, that he could not afford a desperate hunger to consume the trappings of true wealth. He smiled greedily, leaving my desk, and walking out of the study, his footsteps echoing down the long hallway toward the gourmet kitchen. The moment his shadow disappeared around the corner, my entire demeanor shifted. The confused, helpless old man vanished instantly. I moved with a speed and precision that would have terrified him. I crossed the room to the side table where he had carelessly left his silver MacBook sitting completely unguarded. He had not even bothered to close the lid, leaving the screen glowing brightly with his active email inbox displayed. He felt so entirely safe in my home, so incredibly superior to me, that basic security protocols never even crossed his mind. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored vest and pulled out a small, unassuming black USB drive. This was not a standard storage device. Garrison had handed it to me in the soundproof boardroom the day before. It was a highly sophisticated piece of military-grade surveillance hardware programmed to execute a rapid, untraceable infiltration the second it breached a target system. I slid the drive into the side port of Derek's computer. The screen blinked once. A tiny transparent progress bar appeared in the absolute corner of the display, completely invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. I glanced at my gold wristwatch, my heart beating with a steady rhythmic calm. I needed exactly 45 seconds for the script to finish its execution. 45 seconds to completely compromise the man who thought he had ruined me. As the progress bar slowly crept forward, I listened intently to the sounds coming from the kitchen. I could hear the clinking of heavy crystal glasses and the smooth, rich sound of the rare scotch being poured. Derek was taking his time, likely admiring the expensive marble countertops and the custom cabinetry, dreaming of the day he would steal it all. He had absolutely no idea that the man he was robbing was not the technological dinosaur he presumed. He looked at my gray hair and my traditional business suits, and he saw a relic from a bygone era. He assumed that because I built my wealth in commercial real estate, I was ignorant of the digital age. It was a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation on his part. I am 70 years old, but I am far from technologically illiterate. For the last 2 decades of my career, I did not just build concrete shells. I constructed state-of-the-art, fully integrated smart buildings. I developed commercial high-rises with automated climate control systems, biometric security grids, and complex data infrastructures designed to house the most advanced corporate networks in the country. I had spent countless hours sitting in boardrooms with elite cybersecurity engineers learning exactly how digital fortresses were built, and more importantly, exactly how they could be quietly dismantled. I understood network architecture just as deeply as I understood load-bearing walls and structural integrity. Derek's arrogant assumption that my age equated to ignorance was the exact vulnerability I was currently exploiting. 30 seconds had passed. The progress bar was 3/4 of the way complete. The script was silently installing a stealth keylogger deep within the root directory of his operating system. It was designed to bypass his commercial antivirus software completely. From this moment forward, every single keystroke he made, every password he typed, and every encrypted message he sent would be quietly recorded and transmitted directly to a secure server controlled by Garrison. Furthermore, the drive was simultaneously mirroring the current contents of his hard drive, creating a perfect replica of his local files, his hidden folders, and his financial documents. I heard the kitchen faucet turn on and off. Derek was finishing up. 40 seconds. The bar inched toward the finish line. I held my breath, keeping my hand hovering just inches from the USB drive. I could hear his leather shoes stepping onto the hardwood floor of the hallway, making his way back toward the study. 43 seconds. The tiny progress bar flashed green and instantly vanished, erasing all visible trace of its existence. 45 seconds. I smoothly pulled the black drive from the port and slipped it back into the inner pocket of my vest. I took 2 silent steps backward, returning to my own desk, just as Derek walked through the doorway, balancing 2 heavy crystal tumblers filled with the amber liquid. He handed me a glass, his eyes completely drawn to the scotch, entirely unaware that his entire digital life had just been seamlessly copied and permanently compromised. "Here is to your machine running a little smoother, Victor," he said, raising his glass with that infuriating, confident smirk. "And to our ongoing partnership." I raised my glass to meet his, the crystal chiming softly in the quiet room. "Yes, Derek," I replied, staring directly into his deceitful eyes, savoring the profound irony of the moment. "To our partnership. May it yield exactly the results we both deserve." I took a slow sip of the scotch, letting the burn settle in my chest. He turned his attention back to my sluggish computer, resuming his fake tech support routine, clicking his tongue and offering meaningless advice. I stood behind him, nursing my drink, looking at the silver MacBook resting on the side table. The trap was now fully operational. Over the next 30 minutes, Derek finished pretending to clean my hard drive. He deleted a few temporary files, ran a basic defragmentation, and proudly announced that my computer was as good as new. He drank the expensive scotch with deep satisfaction, completely reveling in the power dynamic he believed he controlled. He packed up his things, sliding his compromised laptop back into his leather briefcase, and thanked me for the generous drink. I walked him to the private elevator, once again playing the grateful, accommodating father. I watched the doors close, securing his departure, and immediately turned back toward the study. I reached into my vest and pulled out the black drive, the cold metal feeling heavy and victorious in my palm. I walked to my desk and opened a secured, encrypted communication channel to Garrison. I did not type a message. I simply initiated a file transfer, uploading the mirrored contents of Derek's hard drive directly to the private investigator's secure server. The initial data stream confirmed the successful installation of the stealth keylogger. Within minutes, the first packets of live data began arriving. I could already see the raw text of a message Derek was typing on his drive home, complaining to someone about the tedious task of dealing with my archaic computer. He was laughing at me in the digital shadows, utterly oblivious to the fact that I was now watching every single word materialize on my screen in real time. The feeling of absolute control washed over me. The mourning period was truly over. I was no longer waiting in the dark, guessing at their motives, or searching for clues in the reflections of fake diamond necklaces. I had breached the fortress. I now possessed the master key to his entire operation. I would see his bank transfers. I would read his private emails. I would know the names of his accomplices, his hidden debts, and his genuine vulnerabilities. Every lie he had constructed, every illusion he had sold to my daughter, was about to be laid bare under the harsh, unforgiving light of absolute truth. I poured myself another small measure of the Macallan, staring at the incoming stream of data scrolling across my monitor. The slow, methodical poison they had introduced into my life was about to be turned violently against them. The execution had begun. Early the next morning, before the city had even fully awakened, I found myself sitting across from Mitchell in his sprawling corner office overlooking the Chicago River. The sky outside was a bruised, heavy purple, matching the quiet intensity inside the room. Mitchell had not slept. His massive desk was completely buried under stacks of heavily redacted financial portfolios, property deeds, and corporate tax returns. He had taken my directive from the subterranean boardroom to heart mobilizing his entire team of senior partners to construct the ultimate legal defense. I took a sip of the black coffee his assistant had brought me, feeling the caffeine mingle with the cold adrenaline that had been keeping me awake for days. We had a massive, complex empire to dismantle and rebuild in absolute secrecy. We started with the liquid assets. Over the course of 4 decades, I had accumulated a vast reservoir of cash, municipal bonds, and blue-chip stock portfolios. It was the kind of wealth that made people like Derek salivate. Mitchell explained the strategy with the clinical precision of a surgeon. We were going to move 90% of my total liquid wealth into a newly established, ironclad, irrevocable trust. By legally transferring the ownership of these assets from my personal name to the trust, I effectively stripped myself of direct ownership. I appointed a highly secure, neutral third-party financial institution located out of state as the acting trustee with strict stipulations regarding how and when the funds could be accessed. I designated specific charitable organizations as the primary beneficiaries in the event of my passing, deliberately excluding Valerie completely from the primary distribution channels. If Derek or my daughter attempted to sue me, declare me mentally incompetent, or forcefully extract my capital through fraudulent means, they would hit a solid brick wall. The money would legally belong to an entity that they could not sue, manipulate, or control in any capacity. Once the liquid assets were secured, we turned our immediate attention to the physical empire. My commercial real estate holdings were the true crown jewels of my legacy. Apartment complexes, retail spaces, and office buildings scattered across the city generated massive monthly revenue streams. To protect these, Mitchell initiated a brilliant, aggressive corporate restructuring maneuver. We transferred the ownership of every single property holding company I possessed into a series of blind, limited liability companies registered in the state of Delaware. Delaware corporate law is notoriously protective of privacy, completely shielding the identities of the true beneficial owners from public record. Within 72 hours, my entire portfolio was swallowed by a labyrinth of phantom corporations. Anyone attempting to trace the ownership of my properties would find themselves trapped in an endless, frustrating maze of dead ends and anonymous corporate registered agents. However, there was a critical, delicate psychological component to this operation. While we were draining the vast majority of my actual wealth into these impenetrable legal vaults, I knew I could not leave my primary visible bank accounts completely empty. Derek was cunning, and my keylogger data proved he was actively monitoring my behavior. If he managed to peek at my banking applications or intercept a monthly statement, a zero balance would trigger an immediate catastrophic panic. He would realize I was onto him, and he would completely destroy the evidence of his own fraud before I was ready to strike. Therefore, we deliberately engineered a brilliant financial mirage. Mitchell and I calculated the exact amount needed to maintain the illusion of my immense accessible wealth. We left several $1 million sitting quietly in my primary checking and savings accounts. It was an elaborate stage set, a carefully constructed decoy designed exclusively for Derek's greedy eyes. When he looked at those accounts, he would see a fat, compliant target. He would never suspect that the millions he was salivating over were nothing but a tiny puddle left behind after the ocean had been quietly drained away. While Mitchell furiously executed the legal restructuring, I monitored the incoming data stream from Garrison. The stealth keylogger I had planted on Derek's laptop was providing a terrifying, uninterrupted view into his desperate reality. I sat in my penthouse late at night, watching his keystrokes materialize on my screen. He was bleeding cash at an alarming rate, transferring thousands of dollars to offshore shell companies just to keep his invisible creditors at bay. He was lying to his own employees, fabricating emails from fake investors to maintain the illusion of his artificial intelligence startup. And constantly, relentlessly, he was checking his bank balances, watching the stolen funds from my bridge loan slowly evaporate into the void. He spent hours researching my real estate properties, pulling up public tax records, and saving the documents to a hidden folder labeled with my name. He was calculating my net worth, plotting exactly how much he could extract from me before the entire house of cards collapsed. Every single action he took confirmed the absolute necessity of the financial fortress Mitchell was building around me. By the end of the week, the exhausting, meticulous legal work was finally complete. Mitchell summoned me back to his office to sign the final transfer documents. The stack of paperwork was intimidating, representing the culmination of a lifetime of hard work and sacrifice. I spent 3 hours methodically signing my name to thick stacks of legal paper, legally relinquishing my direct ownership of the empire I had spent my entire adult life building. I signed away the commercial plazas where I had spent my youth negotiating leases. I signed away the luxury apartment buildings I had developed from vacant dirt lots. But I did not feel a shred of loss or regret. Every signature felt like a heavy iron door slamming shut, locking the predators out in the cold. I was securing Martha's legacy, protecting the wealth we had built together from being squandered by a deceitful fraudster and an ungrateful daughter. When I set the pen down for the last time, my hand was cramping, but my mind was completely at peace. Mitchell gathered the massive stacks of documents, organizing them into neat piles and placing them into a secure, fireproof satchel. "You are officially a ghost, Victor," he said, his voice tinged with deep professional satisfaction. He looked at me across the polished mahogany table, his gray eyes reflecting a mixture of respect and awe. "On paper, you possess almost nothing of value, but in reality, you completely control an untouchable, invisible empire. They cannot touch you. They cannot freeze your assets. They cannot steal from you. You are completely insulated from whatever storm is about to hit. The legal barriers we have erected are flawless. If Derek tries to execute a hostile takeover of your finances, he will find himself wrestling with shadows." I stood up, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored suit. "I appreciate your dedication to this task, Mitchell," I replied, my voice steady and resolute. "This is precisely why I have retained your services for all these years. You understand the necessity of absolute defense." I shook his hand, feeling the solid reassurance of a perfectly executed plan. I walked out of Mitchell's office building and stepped onto the busy Chicago sidewalk. The cold wind bit at my face, cutting through my wool overcoat, but I felt incredibly light, practically weightless. For the past 3 months, I had been living under a heavy, suffocating cloud of deception. I had allowed my own daughter and her fraudulent husband to treat me like a disposable asset, a foolish old man ripe for the picking. I had suffered their condescension, their blatant lies, and their thinly veiled insults, playing the part of the compliant victim to perfection. But those days were permanently over. I was now a financial phantom, a man who possessed the ultimate leverage. I drove back to my penthouse, navigating the familiar city streets with a renewed sense of absolute purpose. The fear and hesitation that had plagued me since the day Derek first asked for the bridge loan were completely eradicated. I had built the walls, raised the drawbridge, and heavily armed the defenses. My wealth was safe. My legacy was permanently secure. The stage was finally set for the inevitable and devastating confrontation. Derek was blindly marching toward his own execution, entirely convinced of his own superior intellect, completely unaware that the vast treasury he thought he was infiltrating had already vanished into thin air. I parked in the underground garage and took the elevator up. The silence of the empty rooms no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it felt like a command center where I could monitor the final phases of my operation. I poured myself a single glass of bourbon and sat by the expansive windows, looking out over the glittering skyline. I watched the headlights of cars moving through the grid below, knowing that somewhere out there Derek was desperately scheming, completely unaware of his absolute doom. Exactly. At 1 o'clock in the morning, the subtle chime of my private elevator pierced the heavy silence of the penthouse. I was still sitting by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a half-empty glass of bourbon resting on the side table beside me. The polished steel doors slid open, and Garrison stepped into the dimly lit foyer. He moved with the silent, heavy grace of a man who spent his entire life navigating the darkest corners of human nature. He wore a dark trench coat over his tactical clothing, his face an unreadable mask of grim professionalism. He did not offer a greeting. He simply walked directly into my study, carrying a thick, black leather briefcase. I followed him, turning on the desk lamp, which cast a stark, clinical pool of light across the mahogany surface. Garrison placed the briefcase on the desk, popped the brass latches, and opened it. He did not sit down. He pulled out a stack of heavily redacted financial ledgers, printed surveillance photographs, and encrypted messaging transcripts, spreading them across the wood like a forensic autopsy. "The truth is always uglier than the lie," Victor Garrison said, his deep voice rumbling in the quiet room. "You asked me to tear his life apart. I did. There is nothing left but rot." I stepped closer to the desk, looking down at the meticulously gathered intelligence. "Show me," I commanded softly. Garrison pointed a thick, calloused finger at the first stack of papers. The artificial intelligence software startup does not exist, Victor. It never existed. There is no predictive algorithm, there are no offshore enterprise clients, and there are absolutely no venture capitalists waiting to drop $4 million in a Series B funding round. The entire company is a ghost. It is a registered, limited liability shell company tied to a single post office box in Delaware. The impressive website he showed you was purchased from a freelance designer in Eastern Europe for $600. The downtown office space he claimed to lease is actually a shared hourly co-working hub. He does not have a single employee on a payroll, let alone a team of developers threatening to walk out. Every single word he spoke to you about his visionary tech empire was a meticulously rehearsed absolute fabrication designed specifically to extract your wealth. I absorbed the information without flinching, though the sheer audacity of Derek's deception caused my jaw to tighten. If there is no tech company, I asked, my voice deadly calm, then what is his actual profession? What does he do when he leaves his townhouse every morning in a tailored suit? Garrison slid a second folder toward me, flipping it open to reveal a series of grainy, low-light photographs and printed digital spreadsheets. He is a degenerate gambler, Victor. He is completely, hopelessly addicted. He spends his days sitting in upscale hotel bars and private lounges, aggressively betting on everything from international soccer matches to obscure collegiate athletic events. But he is not using legitimate sports books. He lost his access to legal betting platforms years ago when he bankrupted his own personal credit. For the past 3 years, he has been deeply entangled with an illegal underground sports betting syndicate operating right here in Chicago. They are a highly organized, completely ruthless criminal enterprise, and Derek is currently their most desperate, pathetic client. I stared at the spreadsheets tracing the horrifying trajectory of my son-in-law's catastrophic failures. The numbers were staggering. He had been chasing his losses for years, making increasingly reckless bets in a desperate, futile attempt to dig himself out of a massive hole. The bridge loan, I stated quietly, connecting the final dots of his miserable story. The bank audit was a lie. The compliance freeze was a lie. The $150,000 I wired to him 2 weeks ago. Where did it go? Garrison let out a slow, heavy sigh. It went straight into the pockets of the syndicate Victor. But it did not even scratch the surface of what he actually owes them. The $150,000 you gave him was merely a desperately overdue juice payment. It was just the accumulated interest. He handed over your money simply to buy himself a few more weeks of breathing room. He is completely drowning. Garrison reached into his briefcase one final time, pulling out a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside the bag was a printed photograph. He placed it directly in the center of the pool of light on my desk. The syndicate is tired of his empty promises, Victor. They are not playing games anymore. They are squeezing him, and they are doing it with terrifying precision. Look at the photograph. I looked down, and a sudden violent chill spiked directly through my veins. The picture was taken from a distance, shot through the windshield of a parked car. It showed Valerie. She was walking out of her exclusive Pilates studio in River North, holding her yoga mat, completely unaware that she was being hunted. The syndicate sent this image directly to Derek's burner phone 3 days ago, Garrison explained, his tone completely grim. They wanted him to know exactly how vulnerable his wife is. They wanted him to know that they can touch her whenever they choose. He dropped his burner phone in your foyer because he is living in a state of constant suffocating terror. He knows that if he does not deliver the money, they will come for Valerie. I picked up the photograph of my daughter, staring at her smiling face. She had stood in my living room, wearing fake diamonds, viciously defending a man who had placed a target directly on her back. She had called me a suffocating burden while she was actively being stalked by violent criminals because of her husband's degeneracy. How much, I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh guttural whisper. How much is the actual principal debt? Garrison did not hesitate. The principal is $700,000, Victor, and they are done waiting. The final deadline is this Friday. If Derek does not deliver a cashier's check for $700,000 by Friday afternoon, the syndicate is going to collect their debt in blood. That is the exact reason he has been desperately researching your commercial real estate portfolio. He is actively trying to figure out how to leverage your assets, forge your signature on a larger scale, or steal the title to one of your properties to save his own life. The silence in the study grew overwhelmingly heavy as the full, terrifying scope of the situation finally settled over me. $700,000. Friday. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with devastating clarity. Derek was a cornered animal, and cornered animals were unpredictable and highly dangerous. He had already stolen from me. He had already placed my daughter in mortal danger. He was preparing to steal my properties to pay off violent criminals. I set the photograph of Valerie down on the desk, aligning it perfectly with the fake financial ledgers and the evidence of his gambling addiction. The time for observation was officially over. I looked up at Garrison, my eyes cold and entirely empty of mercy. "I want a meeting with the head of this syndicate," I instructed softly. Garrison blinked, his professional composure faltering for a single second. "Victor, these are not venture capitalists. You cannot negotiate with them." "I am not going to negotiate, Garrison," I replied, my voice hard as steel. "I am going to make a completely different kind of investment." "Set up the meeting." Garrison stared at me for a long moment, the silence in the room thickening as he processed the sheer magnitude of my command. He did not blink. He simply nodded his broad shoulders, shifting under his tactical jacket. "I will make the arrangements tonight, Victor," he replied, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur. "I know exactly who to call to get you in the same room with the leadership. But before we cross that particular bridge, there is something else you need to see. Something that drastically accelerates our timeline." Garrison reached back into the depths of his black leather briefcase. The confident, aggressive momentum I had just built by demanding the syndicate meeting suddenly faltered. There was a distinct hesitance in Garrison's movements, a rare flicker of genuine sympathy in his cold, professional eyes. He pulled out a single manila folder much thinner than the others and placed it squarely in the pool of light on my desk. He did not open it immediately. He rested his heavy hand on top of the cover, looking at me with a grim, unwavering expression. "When I told you Derek was desperately researching your commercial real estate portfolio, I was not simply making an educated guess," Garrison explained softly. "I was watching him search for the specific legal mechanisms required to bypass your ownership. I watched him search for ways to leverage your apartment complexes and office buildings without your direct knowledge or physical presence. I assumed he was looking for a loophole, a blind spot in your corporate structure that he could exploit to secure the $700,000 he needs by Friday. But I was wrong, Victor. He was not looking for a loophole. He was looking for the specific filing procedures for a document that had already been created." Garrison slowly pulled his hand back, leaving the folder resting on the polished mahogany. "Open it," he commanded quietly. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the rough paper, and flipped the cover open. Inside was a high-resolution color-scanned copy of a multi-page legal document. The heavy black heading printed across the top of the first page caused the breath to catch violently in my throat. It was a general power of attorney. I read the dense legal paragraphs, my eyes scanning the meticulous, devastating language. This was not a limited-scope document designed to handle a single real estate transaction or a specific banking matter. This was a comprehensive, absolute transfer of power. It explicitly granted Derek and Valerie total, unchecked control over my entire life. It gave them the legal authority to liquidate my investment portfolios, sell my commercial properties, access my private safety deposit boxes, and drain my checking accounts. It even contained a robust medical directive granting them the ultimate authority to make critical healthcare decisions on my behalf, up to and including placing me in a managed care facility if I were to become incapacitated. It was a legally binding instrument of total financial and personal enslavement. If filed with the county clerk and presented to my banking institutions, this single piece of paper would instantly reduce me to a spectator in my own existence. They would hold the keys to the kingdom, completely free to tear down the empire I had spent 40 years building brick by brick to pay off a violent underground sports betting syndicate. My hands began to tremble as I flipped to the final page of the document, the execution page. I stared at the bottom line where the primary grantor was required to authorize the transfer of power. There, written in bold blue ink, was my signature. I leaned closer to the desk lamp, my eyes narrowing, as I scrutinized the cursive loops and the sharp, distinctive angles of the letters. It was perfect. The slight hesitation on the cross of the letter T, the unique sweeping curve of the capital Vive, the heavy pressure applied at the very end of my last name. It was my signature in every conceivable detail. If a bank manager or a title company executive looked at this document, they would not question its authenticity for a single second. He forged it. I whispered the words, tasting like ash in my dry mouth. I traced the blue ink with my index finger, feeling a wave of nauseating dread wash over me. Derek forged my signature. He replicated it perfectly. He must have spent weeks studying the old greeting cards and birthday checks I gave them, practicing until he got it exactly right. He is going to file this before Friday to steal the money he needs. Garrison shook his head slowly, his expression remaining profoundly dark. He let out a harsh, bitter breath. "No, Victor," the investigator replied, his voice painfully gentle. "Derek did not forge your signature." I looked up from the document, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What are you talking about?" I asked, the edges of my voice fraying with sudden, sharp anxiety. "If Derek did not sign this, then who did? It is my name. It is my exact handwriting. Who else could have possibly replicated it with such terrifying accuracy?" Garrison reached back into the open briefcase and pulled out a small stack of loose-lined notebook paper. He placed the pages directly next to the fraudulent power of attorney. "These were recovered from the trash bin in their home office yesterday afternoon," he explained, pointing to the sheets. I looked down at the lined paper. They were completely covered from top to bottom with hundreds of practice signatures. My name written over and over again, in varying stages of perfection. The top rows were clumsy and disjointed, struggling to capture the natural flow of my handwriting. But as my eyes moved down the pages, the signatures became increasingly confident, increasingly fluid, until the final rows matched the flawless forgery on the legal document perfectly. But it was not the practice signatures that shattered my heart into 1,000 irreparable pieces. It was the handwriting in the margins. Next to the columns of my forged name were small handwritten notes. Reminders about grocery lists, a scheduled hair appointment, a reminder to call a florist. I recognized that handwriting instantly. I had seen it on countless childhood drawings glued to our refrigerator. I had seen it on college application essays and heartfelt Mother's Day cards addressed to Martha. I had seen it on the elegant, embossed invitations to her lavish wedding. It was Valerie's handwriting. The realization hit me with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. The walls of the soundproof study seemed to close in around me, the air suddenly turning thin and unbreathable. I gripped the edge of my mahogany desk, my knuckles turning bone white, struggling to remain standing, as the absolute horror of the truth settled deep into my bones. It was not Derek who had meticulously studied my signature. It was not the desperate gambling fraudster who had spent hours hunched over a desk practicing the exact curvature of my name in order to legally steal my entire life. It was my own flesh and blood. It was the daughter I had carried on my shoulders. The daughter I had worked 80-hour weeks to provide for. The daughter who had looked me directly in the eyes at Sunday dinner wearing her dead mother's fake diamond and smiled while she secretly plotted my total destruction. Garrison continued speaking, his words falling like heavy stones into the silence of the room. "Valerie executed the forgery, Victor. She practiced until it was indistinguishable from your own hand. Then she took the document to a disgraced, unlicensed notary public, operating out of a storefront in the South Loop. A man known to my associates for processing fraudulent auto titles and fake loan documents. Valerie personally handed him $5,000 in cash to stamp and officially seal the power of attorney without you being physically present. She bribed the notary Victor. She orchestrated the entire legal theft. Derek might be the catalyst for their financial ruin, but Valerie is the one holding the knife to your throat. I could not breathe. I could not speak. I simply stared at the blue ink on the final page of the document, the perfect damning evidence of my daughter's ultimate betrayal. For weeks, I had desperately tried to convince myself that Valerie was merely a victim. I had clung to the fragile, comforting illusion that she was blindly manipulated by her charismatic husband, hopelessly trapped in a marriage built on elaborate lies. I wanted to believe that if I could just expose Derek's gambling debts, if I could just show her the terrifying reality of the criminal syndicate, she would wake up. She would run back to me, seeking the unconditional protection she had always known. But the lined notebook paper sitting on my desk destroyed that illusion permanently. Valerie was not a victim. She was an architect. She was a willing, active, and ruthless participant in my execution. She knew exactly what she was doing when she practiced my signature. She knew exactly what she was doing when she handed a dirty notary $5,000 in cash. She was purposefully, intentionally stripping me of my autonomy, my wealth, and my dignity to save the degenerate fraudster she had chosen over her own father. The pain that radiated through my chest was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was worse than the day the doctors told me Martha's cancer had aggressively returned. It was worse than the silence of the empty penthouse in the weeks following her funeral. This pain was sharp, toxic, and entirely suffocating. It was the visceral agony of realizing that the child you brought into this world viewed you as nothing more than a convenient, disposable resource. I closed my eyes, letting the darkness wash over me for a long, agonizing moment. I allowed myself to feel the profound, shattering heartbreak. I allowed myself to mourn the absolute death of my daughter, because the woman who had forged my name to steal my legacy was no longer my child. She was a predator, just like her husband, and she had vastly underestimated the man she was trying to destroy. When I finally opened my eyes, the tears that had briefly threatened to fall were completely gone. The agonizing heartbreak had instantly calcified, hardening into a cold, unbreakable core of absolute, terrifying resolve. The father who had loved her unconditionally was dead, murdered by her own hand. In his place stood a man who possessed nothing but unlimited resources, strategic brilliance, and a singular, devastating purpose. I looked across the desk at Garrison, my posture straightening, my face a mask of smooth, chilling composure. "Keep the meeting with the syndicate," I instructed quietly, my voice echoing with dark finality. "But tell Mitchell to expedite the asset transfers immediately. If my daughter wants to steal my empire by Friday, we are going to make sure she inherits nothing but ashes." Garrison nodded silently, recognizing the absolute finality in my voice, and slipped the horrifying evidence back into his dark leather briefcase. He turned and walked out of the study, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him, leaving me entirely alone in the suffocating quiet of the penthouse. The clock on my desk read 2 a.m, but sleep was an entirely foreign concept. My physical body was exhausted, yet my mind was operating with the terrifying, frictionless clarity of a machine built for war. I walked over to the mahogany desk, pulled out my encrypted laptop, and logged directly into the secure server Garrison had established to capture the data from his completely compromised computer. The screen immediately flooded with a continuous scrolling stream of intercepted digital traffic. I bypassed his mundane web searches and generic business correspondence, diving straight into the encrypted email folders and hidden messaging applications Garrison had unmasked. I was searching for the exact mechanism of their impending attack. I knew Valerie had forged the power of attorney, and I knew Derek owed $700,000 to a violent underground sports betting syndicate. But I needed to know exactly how they planned to connect those two catastrophic realities by Friday. I found the answer buried deep within an archived folder labeled with a generic alphanumeric code. It contained a lengthy chain of emails between Derek and a man named Silas, who utilized a corporate address belonging to an obscure real estate holding group based in the South Loop. I knew enough about the dark underbelly of Chicago commercial development to recognize a front company when I saw one. This was not a legitimate lending institution. This was the clean corporate face of the gambling syndicate designed to wash dirty money and legally absorb the assets of desperate debtors. I opened the first email in the chain, my eyes scanning the harsh, demanding language. Silas was not asking for the money. He was dictating the terms of his survival. I clicked through the attachments, opening a digital copy of a commercial lien agreement, and the blood froze solid in my veins. The document detailed a short-term, high-interest collateral loan for the exact amount of $700,000. But it was the collateral listed on the second page that physically took my breath away. Derek and Valerie had not just promised to repay the syndicate. They had formally pledged two of my most valuable commercial properties as the direct collateral for the loan. The documents listed my premier retail plaza in River North and a massive, fully leased office building in the Gold Coast. The combined market value of those two properties exceeded $12 million. They had used the perfectly forged general power of attorney, complete with the bribed notary seal, to legally bypass my ownership and offer my entire life of work to a criminal enterprise on a silver platter. I read the fine print of the predatory lending agreement. My jaw clenching so tightly, my teeth began to ache. The terms were absolutely brutal, designed specifically to ensure the borrower failed. If the $700,000 principal was not paid in full by this upcoming Friday at exactly 5 p.m, the front company had the immediate, irrevocable right to foreclose on the pledged collateral. They would legally seize $12 million worth of prime Chicago real estate to cover a gambling debt. The syndicate did not want his money. They wanted my buildings. They had engineered a perfectly legal theft, using the forgery of my own daughter as the key to unlock the vault. But the ultimate heartbreak, the final unforgivable betrayal, was waiting in the private encrypted messages between Derek and Valerie. I opened their direct chat history, reading the desperate, panicked conversations they had exchanged over the past 48 hours. Valerie had been terrified by the photograph of her leaving the Pilates studio. She was begging Derek to fix the situation, demanding to know how they were going to survive the week. His response laid bare the true monstrous depths of his cowardice. He outlined his plan to finalize the collateral transfer with Silas, explaining that the syndicate would legally take possession of the buildings on Friday evening. Valerie asked what would happen to me when the holding company executed the foreclosure and seized the properties. Derek typed his reply with chilling, sociopathic detachment. He wrote that the syndicate would naturally assume I was the one who had authorized the loan since my signature was on the primary documents. He stated that when the mob came to enforce the eviction, they would deal directly with me. He explicitly told my daughter that we would just let the old man take the fall, claiming they could use the confusion of the foreclosure to pack their bags and quietly relocate to a luxury villa in Costa Rica until the dust settled. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the exact words my daughter had typed in response to this horrific plan. She did not defend me. She did not express a single shred of guilt or hesitation about feeding her own father to a syndicate of violent criminals. She simply replied that Costa Rica sounded beautiful and reminded Derek to make sure the offshore accounts were properly funded before they went to the airport on Friday morning. They were going to sacrifice me. They were going to let me lose $12 million of my hard-earned legacy, and then they were going to leave me completely alone to face the brutal physical wrath of the Chicago underworld, all so they could escape to a tropical paradise on my dime. I slowly closed the laptop, the soft click echoing in the cavernous study. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the sprawling, glittering expanse of the city I had spent 4 decades trying to conquer. I had built those buildings with my own 2 hands. I had sacrificed my youth, my sleep, and my peace of mind to construct an empire that would protect my family from the harsh realities of the world. And my daughter had just handed the keys to the barbarians, entirely willing to watch me burn, as long as she did not have to feel the heat. The last lingering shadow of my paternal mercy, that small, stubborn ember of unconditional love that had miraculously survived the initial shock of her forgery, was completely extinguished. The father who wanted to save his little girl was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating architect of destruction. I felt no sorrow. I felt no hesitation. I felt nothing but the pure, absolute clarity of a predator preparing to strike. Friday was their deadline, but it was also mine. They believed they had engineered the perfect crime, confident their legal forgery would transfer my wealth to the syndicate while they escaped. They were wrong. I pulled my phone from my pocket and typed a decisive message to Garrison, confirming the syndicate meeting. The time for silent observation had finally passed. It was time for the absolute execution. Thursday morning arrived with a pale, overcast sky that cast a gray metallic light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. I was already awake, dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal suit, waiting for the final act of their pathetic theater to begin. I did not have to wait long. At precisely 9 o'clock, the private elevator chimed. Derek and Valerie stepped into the foyer, projecting an aura of manufactured urgency and fabricated distress. Derek looked significantly worse than he had during his fake tech support visit. His skin was pale, a thin sheen of nervous sweat coating his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. His eyes darted around the room with the frantic, restless energy of a man who knew his time was rapidly running out. Valerie, however, was a portrait of icy composure. She wore a designer trench coat and carried a luxury handbag, stepping into my home with the arrogant entitlement of a conqueror preparing to claim her spoils. They walked into the living room and sat together on the Italian leather sofa. I remained standing by the fireplace, projecting the image of a weary, concerned father. Derek initiated the conversation, his voice trembling with a carefully practiced desperation. He launched into a lengthy, convoluted story about a hostile takeover. He claimed that an aggressive angel investor was attempting to seize complete control of his artificial intelligence startup, threatening to force them into immediate bankruptcy if they did not buy out his initial equity stake. The narrative was a labyrinth of corporate jargon and financial buzzwords, completely devoid of truth, designed to confuse and panic a technologically ignorant old man. And then he delivered the final desperate lie. He looked me directly in the eyes and said that the only way to save their company, the only way to protect their entire future, was to buy out this phantom investor for exactly $700,000. I let a heavy, agonizing silence fill the vast living room. I turned my gaze away from Derek's sweating face and looked directly at my daughter. I searched the depths of her familiar features, desperately hoping to find a single flicker of hesitation, a microscopic trace of guilt, or even a fleeting shadow of the little girl I had loved so fiercely. There was absolutely nothing. Valerie met my gaze with a pair of cold, demanding eyes. They were the eyes of a ruthless predator calculating the exact moment to strike a wounded animal. She leaned forward, resting her manicured hands on her knees, and reinforced her husband's blatant extortion. "We need this money today, Dad," she demanded, her voice sharp and entirely devoid of affection. "If we do not secure this buyout by tomorrow afternoon, we lose everything we have worked for. You have millions sitting idle in your accounts. You owe it to us to help secure our future." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or demand explanations. I simply absorbed the absolute toxicity of her words, letting the final shreds of my paternal mercy wither and die. I looked at the two criminals sitting on my sofa, fully aware that they had already pledged my commercial buildings as collateral to a violent mob syndicate. I offered them a slow, gentle, entirely fabricated smile. "I understand," I said softly, playing the role of the defeated, accommodating father to absolute perfection. "I understand the pressure you are both under. You will have the money. I will contact my bank manager immediately and authorize the release of the funds. Come back here tomorrow at exactly 2 in the afternoon. The cashier's check will be waiting for you on this desk." The visible relief that washed over them was genuinely sickening. Derek exhaled a shaky, prolonged breath, his shoulders dropping as the crushing weight of his impending deadline seemingly vanished. Valerie offered me a tight, victorious smile, completely convinced that her manipulative tactics had flawlessly secured their financial salvation. They did not linger. They practically sprinted back to the elevator, eager to finalize the details of their tropical escape, entirely confident that they had successfully outsmarted a foolish old man. As the heavy steel doors slid shut behind them, sealing their departure, the penthouse returned to a profound, echoing silence. I walked directly into my master bedroom and pulled a single leather duffel bag from the closet. I did not pack designer suits or expensive watches. I packed heavy denim, thick wool sweaters, and a pair of sturdy hiking boots. I was not preparing for a corporate boardroom. I was preparing for the rugged, isolated wilderness of the Wyoming mountains. As I zipped the bag closed, I pulled out my encrypted phone and initiated the final sequence of my defensive strategy. I called Mitchell first. The estate attorney answered immediately, his tone sharp and ready. "Execute the filings." "Mitchell," I commanded, my voice cold and authoritative. Mitchell confirmed that the massive comprehensive fraud reports were already sitting on the desk of the district attorney. The perfectly documented evidence of Derek's money laundering his illegal gambling debts and Valerie's undeniable forgery of the general power of attorney had been officially submitted. In addition, Mitchell had finalized the transfer of my commercial properties into the blind Delaware holding companies, legally neutralizing the fraudulent collateral pledge they had given to the underground syndicate. The financial fortress was locked, sealed, and completely impenetrable. I hung up the phone and dialed Garrison. The investigator answered on the first ring. I gave him a single, simple instruction. "Let the wolves off the leash." Garrison quickly activated his underworld and law enforcement contacts. He methodically ensured the Chicago sports betting syndicate received undeniable proof that the $12 million in commercial real estate Derek pledged to them was completely out of his reach. Garrison made certain the violent criminals realized their desperate debtor was actively attempting to con them with forged documents. He also confirmed that the district attorney was preparing to issue arrest warrants for both Derek and Valerie for grand theft and corporate fraud. The trap was now fully armed, loaded with legal explosives on one side and a furious, defrauded criminal enterprise on the other. I walked out of the master bedroom carrying my leather duffel bag. I moved through the silent, luxurious rooms of my penthouse for the last time. I stopped at the front door, looking back at the mahogany desk in the study where the cashier's check was supposed to be waiting. I reached out and deliberately turned the heavy brass deadbolt, leaving the main door to my penthouse completely unlocked. It was an open, silent invitation for the rats to enter the trap. I rode the freight elevator down to the subterranean garage and climbed into a waiting black car. As the vehicle pulled out into the busy Chicago traffic and merged onto the highway, heading toward O'Hare International Airport, I did not look back at the glittering skyline. I closed my eyes, listening to the hum of the tires against the asphalt, knowing that when Friday afternoon arrived, the storm that hit my empty penthouse would be absolute devastating and entirely of their own making. The first-class cabin of the flight to Jackson Hole was quiet, the soft hum of the jet engines providing a steady background rhythm. I sat in my plush leather seat with a glass of sparkling water resting on the tray table, my eyes locked entirely on the high-definition screen of my tablet. It was exactly 1:55 in the afternoon on Friday. Through the hidden high-resolution security cameras Garrison had discreetly installed throughout my penthouse, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the foyer and my mahogany study. I adjusted the volume on my wireless earbuds, listening to the ambient silence of my empty home. The trap was set. The bait was in place. I only needed the rats to arrive. At precisely 1:58, the heavy metal doors of the private elevator slid open. Derek and Valerie stepped out into the foyer. Through the digital feed, I could see the raw, unfiltered desperation etched deeply into both of their faces. Derek was practically vibrating with nervous energy, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sittings. Valerie walked slightly ahead of him, her posture rigid and demanding, utterly convinced that her manipulation of a foolish old man had secured their total salvation. They did not pause to look around or call out my name. They moved with the blind, singular focus of starving animals scenting a meal, walking directly toward the open double doors of my study. They crossed the threshold into the room, their eyes darting immediately to the center of the massive mahogany desk. I watched Valerie step forward, a look of profound, sickening anticipation washing over her features. She expected to see a pristine, certified bank envelope containing a cashier's check for $700,000. She expected to see the final surrender of my life's work, neatly packaged and ready to be handed over to her violent creditors. Instead, the center of the desk held only a single polished wooden box. It was a beautiful dark walnut cigar box I had owned for decades, simple and unassuming. Valerie stopped dead in her tracks, her triumphant expression fracturing into a mask of sudden sharp confusion. Derek bumped into her shoulder, peering around her to look at the desk. I heard his voice through the audio feed, a high panicked whisper, asking where the check was. Valerie did not answer him. She stepped closer to the desk, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as she reached out to touch the smooth wood of the box. She unlatched the brass clasp and slowly lifted the lid. I leaned closer to the screen of my tablet, savoring every single second of the absolute devastation that was about to unfold. The interior of the box contained exactly 3 items. Valerie reached in and pulled out the first. It was a thick, legally binding stack of papers. Even through the security camera, I could see the exact moment her heart stopped beating. It was a flawless color copy of the general power of attorney she had meticulously forged and illegally notarized. But it was no longer a secret weapon of financial destruction. Stamped diagonally across the entire front page in massive bleeding red ink were the words, "Reported to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for wire fraud and felony forgery." Valerie dropped the document onto the desk as if it had physically burned her flesh. She stumbled backward, a strangled, breathless gasp escaping her throat. Derek lunged forward, snatching the paper from the desk, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated terror as he read the red stamp. He looked at Valerie, his face draining of all color, the horrifying realization dawning on him that I knew absolutely everything. But the execution was not over. Valerie looked back into the wooden box, her shaking hand pulling out the second item. It was a small, crumpled piece of yellow paper. It was the original pawn shop receipt for her mother's flawless diamond necklace. I had visited the seedy shop in River North 2 days prior, purchasing the sacred heirloom back with a staggering amount of cash. Placing that receipt in the box was my final silent message to her. It was my way of telling her that I knew she had sold the only pure thing her mother had ever given her, and that I would never under any circumstances forgive her for it. Valerie stared at the yellow receipt, a single terrified tear rolling down her cheek as the complete destruction of her false reality finally set in. Then the third item resting at the bottom of the wooden box commanded their absolute attention. It was a cheap, black, prepaid burner phone. It was an exact replica of the device Derek had dropped on my marble floor during our fateful dinner. As Valerie and Derek stared down at the inexpensive plastic device frozen in a state of absolute paralyzing dread, the phone began to ring. The harsh digital tone shattered the silence of the study, echoing off the acoustic walls like a siren. Derek physically flinched, backing away from the desk, his hands raised in surrender. "Pick it up," Valerie screamed at him, her voice entirely stripped of its former arrogance, replaced by raw, primal panic. Derek shook his head violently, tears of pure cowardice welling in his eyes. The phone continued to ring, relentless and demanding. Finally, with a trembling hand, Derek reached into the box, picked up the burner phone, and pressed the answer button. He slowly lifted the device to his ear, his breathing ragged and shallow. I turned the volume up on my wireless earbuds, listening intently. Through the highly sensitive microphone hidden in the study ceiling, the voice of the underground syndicate boss echoed clearly into the room. The voice was deep calm and terrifyingly cold. "You thought you could play us, Derek the mob. boss stated, his words dripping with lethal promise. You thought you could pledge $12 million of commercial real estate to us using a forged document. You thought we would not find out that the properties were transferred to a blind trust yesterday morning. Derek began to weep openly, a pathetic whimpering sound that filled me with absolute disgust. No, please, Derek begged, his knees buckling slightly. It is a misunderstanding. The old man must have moved the assets. I can get the money. I just need more time. The voice on the other end of the line let out a dark, humorless laugh. Garrison had done his job flawlessly. He had anonymously delivered the undeniable proof of the forgery directly to the syndicate, completely pulling the rug out from under Derek's desperate scheme. He had also provided the criminals with the exact active location of this burner phone. You are out of time, Derek, the syndicate boss replied, the deadly finality in his tone echoing through the penthouse. $700,000 is due at 5. But since you decided to insult our intelligence with a fraudulent collateral pledge, we are accelerating the timeline. We are coming to the penthouse right now. We are going to collect our debt. And we are going to collect it from you. I watched the screen of my tablet for exactly 3 more seconds. The audio feed transmitted the chaotic, terrified shouting of my son-in-law as the heavy wooden doors of the penthouse study were violently kicked open by the men he had attempted to cheat. I did not need to hear the rest of his pathetic begging. I reached out and tapped the glass screen, severing the connection and plunging the device into total silence. I folded the leather cover over the tablet and placed it neatly into my carry-on bag, just as the captain announced our final descent into Jackson Hole. The private jet banked sharply, breaking through the thick canopy of gray clouds to reveal the sprawling, snow-covered peaks of the Teton mountain range. Looking out the small oval window, I felt a profound sense of closure wash over my tired bones. The toxic, suffocating atmosphere of Chicago was thousands of miles behind me. The storm I had meticulously engineered had finally made landfall, and I was entirely out of its destructive path. The landing gear touched down on the frozen runway with a smooth, heavy thud, signaling the official end of my former life and the quiet beginning of my new one. Exactly 1 week later, I sat on the wrap around cedar porch of my secluded mountain cabin. The air in Wyoming was crisp, carrying a freezing pine-scented bite that instantly cleared the lungs and sharpened the mind. Heavy drifts of pristine white snow blanketed the surrounding forest, completely isolating the property from the noise and deception of the modern world. I was wearing a thick wool sweater and heavy denim, a stark contrast to the tailored business suits that had defined my existence for 4 decades. The profound silence of the wilderness was a welcome companion. For the first time since Martha passed away, my chest did not feel tight with anxiety or grief. I was simply a man sitting alone in the cold, observing the slow, steady rhythm of nature. I reached for my tablet, which was resting on the small rustic table beside my rocking chair. I tapped the screen, bringing up the secure digital dossier that Mitchell and Garrison had been updating daily. It was time to review the final casualty report of the war my daughter had foolishly started. The headlines from the Chicago financial news outlets painted a vivid, catastrophic picture. Derek was currently sitting in a federal holding facility without the possibility of bail. According to Garrison's detailed notes, when the syndicate enforcers breached the penthouse and realized the collateral was legally worthless, they did not kill him. Killing him would not recover their $700,000. Instead, they delivered a brutally clear ultimatum, promising to dismantle his life piece by piece unless he produced the cash. Derek, driven completely mad by his own cowardice, made the only desperate move left available to him. He walked directly into the local field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and confessed to massive corporate wire fraud. He practically begged the federal agents to arrest him, desperately seeking the fortified walls of a government prison to hide from the lethal wrath of the underground mob. He traded his freedom for physical safety, permanently destroying his reputation, his career, and his entire future in a single pathetic afternoon. His artificial intelligence startup was publicly exposed as a hollow shell company, and his name became synonymous with absolute disgrace in the local business sector. Valerie's fate was equally devastating, completely stripped of the luxurious insulation she had always taken for granted. The federal authorities had immediately launched a sweeping, aggressive investigation into her direct involvement with the fraudulent loan. The undeniable evidence of the perfectly forged general power of attorney, complete with the extensive pages of her handwritten practice signatures that Garrison had recovered from her trash bin, provided the prosecutors with an airtight case for felony forgery. She was officially listed as an active accessory to massive wire fraud. The authorities immediately froze the meager dwindling assets remaining in their personal bank accounts. The bank holding the mortgage on their elegant townhouse initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings, forcing her out onto the street, with nothing but a few suitcases of designer clothes. The wealthy elite social circles she had cultivated so carefully instantly abandoned her, treating her like a toxic pariah. She had gambled her father, her family, and her entire inheritance on a degenerate liar, and she had lost absolutely everything. I closed the digital dossier, locking the screen, and setting the tablet face down on the table. I did not feel a rush of triumphant joy, nor did I feel the hollow sting of regret. I felt only the cold, sterile satisfaction of a meticulously balanced ledger. They had demanded a transaction, and I had simply provided the receipt. I turned my attention away from the tablet and looked at the items resting on the opposite side of the small cedar table. A framed silver photograph of Martha sat catching the pale morning light. She was smiling, her eyes crinkling at the corners with that warm, fierce intelligence that had guided our marriage through its hardest years. Resting carefully on the table directly beneath her photograph was the original flawless diamond necklace. It sparkled brilliantly against the rough grain of the wood, completely unblemished by the seedy, desperate environment of the pawnshop where Valerie had so callously discarded it. I had paid a premium to retrieve the sacred heirloom, returning it to its rightful place beside her memory. I reached for the heavy crystal decanter sitting next to the picture frame and poured a generous measure of expensive aged bourbon into a heavy glass. The amber liquid glowed warmly in the freezing mountain air. I picked up the glass, feeling its solid, comforting weight in my hand. I looked directly into the silver frame, meeting my late wife's smiling eyes. "You were right, Martha," I said, my voice echoing softly into the vast, silent expanse of the snow-covered forest. "We could not buy his character, and we could not buy her loyalty." I raised the crystal glass in a silent, solitary toast to the woman who had helped me build my empire. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bourbon. The smooth, fiery heat traveled down my throat, warming my chest against the biting chill of the Wyoming winter. I breathed in the crisp, freezing mountain air, letting it fill my lungs completely. The brutal, agonizing conflict was definitively over. I had lost a daughter to the corrosive sickness of greed and deception, a reality I would carry for the rest of my days. But as I looked out over the towering, unbreakable peaks of the mountain range, I knew I had made the only acceptable choice. I had successfully retained my empire. I had fiercely protected my absolute freedom. And above all else, I had preserved my dignity against those who sought to strip it away. The predators had been utterly defeated. The fortress was completely secure. I sat back in the rocking chair. The conflict is over. I am at peace.